talk I've given a few times now. I was meant to be giving the talk in Poland when COVID-19 first kicked off. So unfortunately, I didn't get to go to Poland. But yeah, so it's just a little intro. Hopefully, you'll come away from the session having more questions about contract testing than when you started. But if you want to hit me up on any of the channels, feel free. Also, if you want any consultancy work, now with the COVID-19 situation, I'm down to 80% at Cancer Research. So I've got a little bit of time to give to the community. So the first thing to do is, if you can, go to menti.com, www.menti.com, and use the code. I want you to name one thing that you already know about contract testing. I like to do this at the start of the session to kind of gauge the audience. Obviously, I'm going to go through some of the concepts of it, but yeah, it's good to know what people already know. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that.
Now I can hear.
Nice, getting some really good answers so far. Cool, just give it one more minute and then we'll look at some of the answers. So there's some really good stuff here that people have said. Validating boundaries at the API layer, I really like that explanation. Consumer driven is a massive part of contract testing. People putting about Pact, and Pact is a tool that I'll be talking about later. Microservices is definitely a nice environment to run contract testing, and throws up a lot of reasons why you would do contract testing. So yeah, some really good stuff there. So you're all experts already. So what is contract testing? So the way that I like to look at it is that it is a tool that enables the communication between your provider team and your consumer team. So what do these terms actually mean? So consumer is the person that's interacting with the API, usually via an HTTP request. So once the consumer knows how they want to interact with that API, that's the expectations that are generated and are defined in a contract. So when the API documentation starts, everyone agrees this is how we're going to use the API. But that is at the point before development starts. And I'll talk about legacy systems later, but in the traditional consumer-driven contract testing, you want to start doing contract testing when the API documentation is defined. And so then when you're defining those scenarios, you can generate those and put them into a contract. So how does contract get used? So that's for the provider to replay those contracts in their environment. So looking at your local environment or wrapping your API in an in-memory server or something similar. So the provider now is not guessing how the consumer is using it, and they are not generating their own scenarios to test against. Also, they're not using the API documentation to determine what scenarios they need to test against. They're actually using real life scenarios that the consumer has defined. So once you've got your contracts generated from the consumer, you publish them to Pact Broker. Pact Broker is a service that Pact provides in order to store all of your contracts. And at the point where you've stored your contracts, you can now see all the interactions that those providers have. So you can see what consumers are using it, and you can also see the interactions between them. So it gives you a good map of what your architecture looks like. I know from my personal experience, we have APIs where we don't know all of our consumers, or we definitely misinterpret how those consumers are using it, especially in terms of legacy systems, which we rely on them to update to later versions, but in actual fact, that isn't the case. So what scenarios does contract testing make sense? I guess is the right way to look at it. And when you're thinking about testing, comparing that against your traditional integration tests will give you a good picture of the comparison of what contract testing can provide over your traditional end-to-end functional tests. So when you're generating your contract, you're assuming that everyone's going to follow that contract. And then obviously you get to the point where integration environment is spun up. You want to make sure that everyone is integrated successfully, and that's where you find integration issues in the traditional setting. When you're during the development phase, usually you would use mocks and stubs to mock out the external dependencies that you don't own and you don't that you rely on. So when you're building your API or you're building your front end, you want to run your test in an isolated, stable environment. And hopefully contract testing can provide you that format. So the other thing is, when you're testing in your integration environment, it's too late. You want that fast feedback. You want to be able to achieve a setting where you're writing your code and you're running your unit tests, and then you run your integration tests locally against your stubs or mock server. You want to make sure that that is valid feedback, that you're building the right thing and it's not going to break when you get to the integration environment. So the other thing is, when you're developing your API, you have to make sure that you support different conditions. And often your integration environment will be in a different version to your production version. So how do you know when you're going to release that the integration environment support is a replica of your production environment? So versioning is key in contract testing. So all the problems that we have just identified, contract testing can support that. And it's not a complex thing. I think the difficulty is in the traditional methods. When you're developing software and when you're within a established development team, you're doing things in the way you know how. You're building the software, you're moving quickly in an agile environment to be able to deploy software quickly. But in the world of continuous deployment, you're a button click away from getting to production. So how do you want to make sure that everything is safe to go and you're not breaking anything on the way through? Obviously, you can have as much test coverage as you like, and you can have as much input from multiple teams as you like, but how do you actually know that you've built the right thing? So I've got another little task for everyone. So now if you go to menti.com and enter the new code, if you can give a thumbs up when you arrive, then that would be great. So the scenario that we're going to be using is password strength. Obviously, password strength is much more complicated than this, but a simplified view is the max is 50 characters, the min is 10 characters. You get an invalid 400 bad request when the password isn't strong. And also, you can't enter a password that is a common password within the Pwn Passwords API. So we'll wait for everyone to join, and then we'll go ahead with the scenario. I hope the question marks mean that people have arrived and aren't confused. I'm enjoying the online format of this meetup, because usually I do this in person, and then you have to embarrassingly ask everyone to raise their hand if they have navigated. Often they're not connected to the Wi-Fi either, so the internet is poor in the forums that I have presented before. don't think this one has a timer, so we can go to the next section. So which of these would contract testing apply? So you can choose multiple options, and I'm going to hide the results so people can't use other people's. So you've got bad request, you've got password stored in the database, you've got password exists in the pwned passwords API, and you've got different password entries, e.g. password 1 and password 1 with a symbol. So select all that apply for contract testing. Once we've got a few more entries, then we'll go through some of the answers. Feel free to add more while we're going through. Okay, let's show the results. We got some in all categories. So obviously bad request is a perfect example, right? This is a defined scenario in your API documentation. You want to be able to support error scenarios, and you want to make sure that the API is catching it and failing gracefully. You've got passwords stored in database. So this is actually a trick, because contract testing, you won't be communicating with the database directly. You'll be using the contracts that are stored in the Pact broker. So you don't actually want to rely on your database. But obviously the 200 response is a perfectly valid scenario. So passwords exist in the pwned API, which is a really good one, because pwned is a third party, but you've got their documentation, right? So that is your contract. So you know which version of the API you're using, you know that how you're using it. You are the consumer in this scenario. So that's a really good one. So different password entries. This is where you get into an overlap with your functional tests, because contract test is defining the contract. So we've already tested our bad request at this point. So you don't want to pass in multiple different scenarios for this. The contract is determining the condition at which the bad request occurs. So once you've validated that, you're not getting more value in running different scenarios. That is a functional test. Okay, so we've got one more scenario. So you're going to release, and the API has a breaking change. the configuration is updated on all your test environments before you go to production. So this scenario is where you haven't got contract testing at the moment. And you've run your end-to-end functional tests against the new API version on your integration environment. So you're happy that all the tests pass and you're ready to go to production. So this is a timed question, so you've got to be fast. So I'll release the question and yeah, be quick. Okay. So what won't be caught by contract testing is the question. Cool. So yes, definitely. Configuration changes won't be caught because they're not defined in the contract, and that's where your integration testing comes in, right? When you run your integration test, you want to check that the API has been deployed successfully to the environment, and you want to run your smoke test to check that the configuration changes have been applied. The API version, you should have a endpoint to be able to validate that, and that is exactly what you would have been testing in your contract tests. So you'll be pointing it to a specific version, or you'll be pointing it to the latest version. So yeah, you definitely know what version you're compatible with. Bad request is definitely a scenario we're going to capture because that's defined in our contract. And third party, this was a red herring that I threw in there, but I didn't mention it in the previous question about the fact that we do actually have the API documentation for our third parties. So when they make changes, we should know about it on our test environments and be able to simulate that condition. So you'll be happy to hear that's the end of the the questions for the meetup. So let's put this into real life conditions. So you have some helping out with the SafePath COVID-19 tracker at the moment. So you have that, you download the app on your phone, and it tells you whether you've been in contact with infected persons in your vicinity, and then you can take yourself out of that situation and self-isolate, or you can, well, yeah, that's what you do, right? That's government advice. So there's an API that provides that, and when you have the contact, it reports it. So the user, the consumer in the scenario, is spinning up a mock API provider in order to verify the contracts that they are creating. So what it does is it creates the request, and then you actually send a real request to the Pact server. And so what it's doing is it's simulating what you have created. So what you create in the code is what you actually meant to create. So once you've created the mock and run your test against it, then it will spit out a contract. And once the contract has been spit out, then you can verify the API provider can verify against that contract. So how does it work in Pact? So everyone writes TDD, as we all know, and so you're writing a code and you're mocking your responses, and then you make the request to the server and it spits you out a Pact file. So the Pact file is then pushed up to the Pact broker, which can then verify the version. It can show you the different scenarios, and then the provider can pull down the contract, trigger the test, and verify that the contract matches with the code that they have written. So I've got a little video to demonstrate how this works. So you run your consumer test, that all passes, and your contracts have been generated and put in a Pact folder. So once you've done that, you want to publish them. So you publish them up to the broker. So I'm just going to pause at that point and show you what the broker looks like. So this is the test Pact broker. So it has loads of contracts in here. So when you publish it to here, you can see the consumer and the provider. And you just click in here, and this is what defines the contract that you created. So you've got the method, you've got the path, and you've also got the expected response. The thing about the response is that you'll use matches, and matches will tell you, will tell the provider that we're expecting an array or we're expecting a string, and so you don't need to rely on static data that I was adhering to earlier. And if we click on one of these consumers here, this is the diagram that I showed you a bit earlier about all the interaction points and who is consuming what. So it gives you a really nice feel for who your consumers are, and then you can dig in and you can see how they're using it as well. So that's that. So once you're happy with the contracts that you've published, you then pass them over to the provider, and then the provider can run them against their local API. So finished a bit quickly. So you can see that they have run against these conditions. They've requested for an animal with a specific ID, and the response status code has the matching body. So once this has been verified, you can use a tool called Can I Deploy, which Pact provides. So once you're happy that the contracts have been verified, and you ping Can I Deploy, because on the Pact it tells you when it was last verified. So the Can I Deploy will determine whether it has been verified. And then you're ready to go. As a contract, as a provider, as an API provider, you're happy that all the consumer scenarios that have been detailed in the broker are working, and you're happy that you tested against the right version of the consumer that is in production, so any compatibility issues are going to be caught. So yeah, that's a quick overview of how you would use contract testing, and hopefully provided you with scenarios of how you would use it. Obviously, in your setting, it's going to be, there'll be different conditions and there'll be different ways in which you want to implement it. But going back to my point earlier about communication, for me, what it has done is it has enabled whereby you would get bugs raised in integration environments. Now you're talking about things at a much earlier stage. And also you're talking about things in the perspective of the consumer. You're not saying my integration test failed. I think you updated something on your side. Can you look at it? It's a collaborative effort now. And as the tests are stored in the two repositories, you now own the quality of your product, and also the provider owns the quality of the application as a whole. So I think it offers that relationship that you can build, and now you're working together rather than you're relying on static assets, which might change over time. One thing to mention about the API versioning as well is API documentation lives in different formats, lives in your Swagger documentation, which is generated from code. So is that testing the right thing, or is that just showing you what the code has generated? It lives in wikis, which go out of date, as we know, the second you write them. Lives in documentation which may be incorrect at the point of time where you're looking at it, unless you validate with the owner of it before you do any changes, but we all know that that can be difficult. So I wanted to present my current challenge to hopefully get people's viewpoints and to check my understanding of it as well, because I think one thing to note is that this isn't a story of my success of running contract testing and now we have no bugs in production. This is no integration bugs. This isn't that. This is my journey of adopting contract testing and the lessons I've learned along the way, and hopefully I can share those experiences with you and other people in the testing community. So yeah, I'm still on a journey, and hopefully I can get people's advice and more people can start using contract testing so we can get a broader conversation on it rather than people sticking to their traditional methods. So this is the environment that I'm working in. I'm a QA at Cancer Research, and I oversee all of the projects that we have going. So we have a fundraising platform. So all of the fundraising contributions come through one platform. What happens is we can make a request to our payments API. The API puts the message on a queue to say, please, can you process this payment? And then the queue has some validation rules, which it applies, and then is inserted in the database. The database is where the success or failure response is returned. So when you make the request to the initial API, the API isn't hanging around to see what has happened. It's just posting to the queue and giving you a 200 response to say whether it was added successfully or not. So you're not getting your bad request response here. You have to verify that in the database. So what I have done is we have created a contract test outside of Pact. We are using, we write our test in JavaScript, so we're using Stomp to connect to the queue, and we're obviously using SQL connectors to connect to the database. So what happens is the consumer adds their contracts, which they have generated from the scenarios that they are using in their application, and they are in XML. So we put them in GitHub. So then the contracts are stored in GitHub in their repository. And then the provider tests, what the providers do is they pull down the latest version of that GitHub repository. They grab all the XML files and they put them on the queue. So once they put them on the queue, they then start polling the database to see whether the processing has completed and whether it was a success or a failure. And then we verify at that point whether the XMLs that were provided by the consumer were valid or not, and adhere to the contracts that the API, I mean, that has been documented previously. So I hope that makes sense, but obviously, yeah, hopefully get your feedback on that at a later date. So that's it for the talk today. If you need more convincing, Pact has a really helpful FAQ page where you can be convinced further. I think just to summarize my points, we're not replacing the other testing types. It's not getting rid of your integration tests. It performs a different function. It's a really helpful tool in enabling your teams to collaborate and enabling fast feedback. And it can be your living documentation. It provides you that format to be able to host the contracts and update them and update the versions and make sure that all the consumers are conforming with that. So yeah, that's it from me. Billy, do we have any questions or anything?
I can't really see many on the chat. I think if people want to, yeah, just unmute themselves and maybe ask questions, that'd be great.
Hi, this is Shabazz. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Just a little small question about, you know, when the consumer and API, the diagram that you showed, in some cases, in my scenario, and as well, in some of the places we see there's a wrapper, like a client, something like a GraphQL, which actually takes and translates it to the API. So any of the changes the API makes, so it doesn't, you know, why the GraphQL is there. On that scenario, do you think contract testing is relevant, or, I mean, what's your opinion on it? That's it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think it depends on how the GraphQL is set up, to be honest. But you still want to make sure that you're doing things as per the documentation, right? Like you want to, you don't want to deliberately pass in bad data. I think if we look at one of the scenarios that I've had in my personal experience, we had version 1 and version 2 API. We were supporting V1 and we communicated that it was going to be deprecated. We made sure that everyone had migrated up to our best knowledge. We didn't have contract testing across all the consumers. And we make a break-in change to V1 because we think everyone who needs that functionality has already been migrated, and we had a high priority bug in V1 that we had to fix. So we make a breaking change to the API, and actually there is a legacy system which is still using V1, which relies on that bug because they've got a workaround on it. So I can see your point about translating it, but that just facilitates bad practices in my thinking right now. But I'm just thinking out loud. I would have to see the implementation a bit more detail to be able to kind of come up with a clearer answer. I hope that's answered your question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of thoughts. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Thanks.
Hi, Louis. It's Marie. I
Hi.
have a quick question because we're currently using Pact, and I currently did a spike on how to use the Can I Deploy tool so consumers can safely deploy their changes. But I still haven't had the chance to look at using their webhooks, because what we want is, let's say if we the consumer push a new contract, we want the provider to run their tests as well. Do you have any sort of experience on how that was set up?
I don't have experience with webhooks, to be honest. My thoughts on that would be, though, in a CI environment, you should be running all your tests anyway. So there should be no opportunity for you to fall out of sync, and hopefully before your providers are pushing anything to their test environments or any other environment, and they should be using those contract tests and that Can I Deploy tool. So yeah, I think a trigger is a sensible idea, but in CI, I don't know how much value it would add to your current setup.
Cool. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I can see, Billy, I can see a couple of questions from the chat. Do you mind if I just go with those?
Yeah, definitely. Go for it.
So one of the questions was, are we expected to do this as testers? As you talk about when you were developing your API, that's not where testers are testing. Who is contract testing aimed at, developers or testers? So quality should be embedded from the start. So testers should care about it. If I do see developers definitely being involved in helping you wrap the API to be able to perform contract testing, or providing you with an opportunity to spin up the local environment in your CI so you can point it towards that. So yeah, I definitely see developers being involved in the process, but yeah, I would say testers have that kind of holistic view and would really care about how the consumers are using it. So I would definitely think that testers would be heavily involved. Got another question. How do you convince skeptical devs to look at this? When I've approached before, they don't see how their unit tests don't do the job and would stop them adding breaking code. So this is a really common one that I have had, and I've had a lot of questions about it. So I always refer to the test pyramid in this scenario, because the unit tests won't be testing everything, right? We all know that 100% unit test coverage is not actually telling you everything about the application. And the benefits that I described earlier that contract testing really does provide is that faster feedback. You're not waiting for the integration test environment. You're not waiting for something to be pushed. You're testing it right there and then, and you're also offering the opportunity to collaborate. Worked in a lot of environments where the microservices are built independently, as it makes sense to split your teams, right, between microservices, because that's the quickest way that you can upskill people on that, and they own that area and they deploy that as frequently as they can. But actually that means that your monolith now, where the breaking change actually did mean that your repo couldn't be deployed because you had failing unit tests, now you don't know whether your code actually broke someone else's because all your tests passed. So yeah, I think that's how I would describe it. And it is that faster feedback loop which I think is a real benefit to devs. And if they like, it's like doing TDD, right? Everyone says, oh, it slows me down at the start, but then actually when you get good at TDD, then you realize actually this is making me go faster. So yeah, I think it is a learning curve, but it would hopefully have benefits, and that's the way to sell it. Getting loads of questions. So what has been your biggest blocker for rolling out this method, and how did you overcome it? So that's a great question. So the biggest blocker is consumers, right? Consumers have their own priorities, they have their own testing methods. They may say that they are happy with the current situation, which I've had, which is very frustrating. But yeah, the biggest is getting consumers buy-in, because you're the API provider, you're meant to own your API, and you're meant to own the releases, and you're meant to communicate changes, and the constructor of the API documentation is meant to communicate that out to the wider team, and they may not be directly correlated to your team, so you may have dependencies there, and it can spiral into a conversation about who owns what. So the biggest blocker is definitely getting buy-in from your consumers. But I think going back to the scenario with the queue-based system that we've implemented at Cancer Research, I think we've really embraced it, and we've got over a lot of hurdles that we would have had before about the delay in getting feedback, because now we're just submitting straight to the queue. We're not relying on all the other dependencies that contract tests would have relied on before. And our integration environments are notoriously unstable because of the nature of the data and the sensitivity of things. There's often jobs going on, overwriting things, and payment systems going down. So yeah, we've seen huge benefits basically. Got another question about contract testing being integrated into CI/CD pipeline, and I usually do mention about this, but I don't think I did today. So contract testing fits perfectly into your CI pipeline, just runs alongside your unit tests. If you're using Pact.js, then you just run npm run packs or whatever script you set up to run your tests, and it will just run alongside that. Sorry. So yeah, just runs alongside your unit tests. Don't need to worry about setting anything else up. Obviously you can run it in Docker as well. I've wrapped some of my tests in Docker so that I can just plumb that into the CI pipeline. I don't need to worry about setting up the environment for it every time. So I've got another question. Do you have to be proficient in JavaScript to use this? Pact supports lots of different languages. It's originally built in Ruby, and so all the other implementations are just wrappers around the Ruby implementation. So no, you don't have to be good at JavaScript. And one of the core things about setting up this contract framework, and if you do get developers involved or you get other more technical testers involved, then once it's set up, all you're doing is adding scenarios, and it's a really simple thing to do. You can look at the Pact documentation in the language of your choice, and you can see the simplicity of it. You're just setting up the request as you would in any other tool, and then pushing it up there. So no, you don't have to be proficient at all. I would highly endorse people to look at it if they don't have programming experience. Cool, that's all the questions on the chat. Do we have, oh no, it's another one that's just popped up. What are alternatives for Pact? I really don't have a good knowledge on alternatives, and it's a really bad thing to say, because if I was supporting any other framework like UI with Cypress or Selenium, I would have done a comparison, but I haven't, I'm afraid. One common question that I get actually is people saying that they have tests that are generated from their Swagger docs, and so they don't really see the value in contract testing as well as the Swagger tests. But yeah, I think it's what works for you, and I think Swagger is great for determining whether you've built what you expected to build, but not what might be needed for the wider group. So yeah, microservices again is the answer to that one. Microservices are independent things, and you need to make sure that you're integrating properly. Cool. Marie's answered. Hopefully you can use Postman. Cool. Yeah. Any other questions on the floor?
I think we're all good.
Sweet.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks very much for that, Lewis. Thanks for that intro. Hopefully people have learned a lot and have taken something away from this today. Of course, thanks everyone for coming along and for giving the talk today, Lewis. We are going to be running a number of different talks. If you do have any further questions, Lewis, guess what's the best means to sort of reach out to you? Is it Twitter?
Yeah, hit me up on Twitter, or connect with me on LinkedIn. Yeah, or you can submit a form on my Wix site that I've created to try and get some consultancy work. Yeah, you can, any of those channels really.
Good stuff. Well, look, huge thanks, Lewis. Thank you to everyone for being part of Quality Advocates, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one. Thanks very much.
Right, thanks for the feedback, everyone. Cheers.
Yes, have a good one, guys. Bye-bye.
Cheers, Shabazz. Bye-bye.
Hi, Billy. Are you there?
No, he cancelled the session.
I'm still here.
Hey, Billy. This is Sudesh now. Sorry, I logged in as my daughter's name. Actually, I missed